The Apex Academy was the quietest place in the known universe. It hung in the serene, star-dusted void of the Oort cloud, a perfect, shimmering sphere of living crystal, and contained light that was less a school and more a shrine to the sacred act of knowing. For millennia, it had served as the singular, elite institution for the children of the galaxy's most advanced and logical species, the children of the crystalline Cathar, the energy-based axiom, and a dozen other races whose minds were as ordered as a mathematical proof came here to be filled, to have the accumulated knowledge of the cosmos downloaded directly into their consciousness. There were no teachers, only curators. There were no classes, only data streams. And there was most certainly no recess. There was only the silent, beautiful, and profoundly serious business of becoming perfect. The philosophy of the Academy was simple. The universe was a data set, and the purpose of a sentient mind was to be the perfect vessel for that data. Learning was a passive, silent process. A student would enter a sterile white learning pod, connect to the Academy's vast telepathic core, and for a prescribed period, information would flow. The history of 1 billion years, the laws of 11 dimensions, the poetry of 1,000 dead suns. It was all just data to be absorbed without question, without interpretation, and most importantly, without the messy, inefficient, and deeply illogical contamination of emotion. Play was a concept so alien to the Academy's charter that it did not even have a word for it. The closest equivalent was random, non-productive energy expenditure, a diagnostic term for a malfunctioning drone. It was into this temple of silent, sterile perfection that the first human children arrived. Their inclusion was a political necessity, a concession to the Terran Federation's noisy, chaotic, and increasingly unavoidable presence on the galactic stage. The Academy's High Curator, a towering, ancient Cathar of flawless clarity named Xylar, had reviewed the data on human children and had, in a rare display of systemic alarm, almost vetoed the entire exchange. The human child's mind, the preliminary scans had shown, was a cognitive disaster area. It was not a clean, orderly receptacle waiting for data. It was a howling, chaotic, and beautiful tempest of half-formed thoughts, irrational fears, nonsensical songs, and a powerful and deeply, deeply illogical drive for something the data logs could only classify as fun. Against his better judgment, the exchange was approved. 3 human children, the first of their kind to ever set foot in the hallowed, silent halls of the Apex Academy, were on their way. Lily was 8 years old, and she was, even by human standards, a force of nature. She had a mop of unruly black hair that refused to be contained, eyes that were a deep, mischievous brown, and a mind that was a constant, whirring engine of questions, ideas, and a profound and deeply ingrained aversion to sitting still. She had been chosen for the program because her psychological profile showed a high degree of adaptability and a low degree of respect for arbitrary rules, qualities the Federation's diplomats had, with a stunning lack of foresight, presented to the Academy as leadership potential. The other 2 humans were twins, a boy and a girl named Leo and Lena, who were quieter than Lily but who possessed a shared, silent language of mischief that was, in its own way, just as chaotic. Their arrival was a quiet cataclysm. They stepped out of their shuttle into the Academy's great silent receiving chamber, and the first thing they did was make a noise. Lily gasped, a sharp, audible intake of breath at the sheer crystalline beauty of the place, and the sound, in the profound, tomb-like silence of the hall, was as loud and as shocking as an explosion. Xylar, who had come to greet them, felt the sound as a physical blow, a discordant, messy, and deeply, deeply organic vibration that was an insult to the clean, pure, and silent harmony of his home. The 3 human children, with their fidgeting, their whispering, their strange, expressive faces, were not just a new variable in his perfect, logical equation. They were a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly, wonderfully chaotic mistake. The experiment had begun, and Xylar, for the first time in 1,000 years of serene, logical contemplation, had a feeling that he could only, and with a deep and deeply unsettling sense of dread, classify as a very, very bad one. The first day of lessons was, for Lily, Leo, and Lena, a unique and exquisite form of torture. They were each led to their own personal and terrifyingly white learning pod. The interior was a single, soft, form-fitting chair and a blank white wall. There were no buttons. There were no screens. There was only the gentle psychic hum of the core and the silent and deeply, deeply boring flow of pure, unadulterated data. Lily's first lesson was on the history of the axiom concordance, a billion-year saga of pure mathematical and utterly eventless harmony. The data flowed into her mind, a clean, elegant, and soul-crushingly dull stream of facts. She learned of their transition from a physical to an energy-based form. She learned of their complex and deeply uninteresting social mathematics. She did not learn about their heroes, their villains, their triumphs, or their tragedies, because the axiom did not have them. They had only a long and unbroken and deeply, deeply boring history of being correct. Lily, a child whose entire concept of learning was based on stories, on characters, on the messy, beautiful, and deeply, deeply interesting drama of history, tried to fight back. Her mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, began to create its own narrative. She imagined the axiom not as beings of pure logical energy, but as a race of grumpy, glowing triangles who were constantly arguing about who had the sharpest corners. She gave them names, personalities, and a series of increasingly ridiculous and completely fictional civil wars. The clean, pure data stream of the core was being systematically and joyfully vandalized by the graffiti of an 8-year-old's imagination. The curator monitoring her session, a junior lumina whose own mind was a placid sea of quiet contemplation, sent a frantic and deeply alarmed psychic pulse to Xylar. "Hi, curator," the thought chimed, a note of pure systemic panic in its perfect harmony. The human one unit is corrupting the data. She is not absorbing the history of the axiom, she is making fun of it. After the prescribed learning period, the bell for the first nutritional and system optimization break chimed. This was the Academy's version of recess. The alien children, the Cathar and the axiom and the others, filed silently out of their pods and formed a series of perfect orderly lines in the great, white central plaza. They stood, their bodies motionless, their minds silently processing and categorizing the morning's data. It was a time for quiet mental digestion, a silent and deeply, deeply serious period of cognitive optimization. Lily, Leo, and Lena stumbled out of their pods, their minds numb with a boredom so profound it was almost a physical pain. They looked at the silent, orderly lines of the alien children, and they looked at the vast, empty, and terrifyingly, wonderfully open space of the plaza. And Lily, with a spark of pure, unadulterated, and life-affirming genius in her mischievous brown eyes, did the one simple and revolutionary thing that would change the Apex Academy and the galaxy forever. She grinned, a wide, chaotic, and deeply, deeply human expression, and she said the one simple and magical word that the Academy had never in a million years of perfect, silent knowing ever heard before. "Tag," she yelled, her voice a joyful, defiant, and beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic bomb in the silent, sacred heart of the Temple of Knowledge. And then, with a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy, she tapped her brother on the shoulder and began to run. The concept of tag did not compute. For the assembled children of the galaxy's most logical species, the scene unfolding in their tranquil plaza was a catastrophic and deeply fascinating system error. The human 1 unit, Lily, was engaged in a high-velocity, non-linear, and seemingly pointless ambulatory exercise. The human 2 unit, Leo, was pursuing her, his own face a mask of simulated and deeply illogical distress. The human 3 unit, Lena, was emitting a series of high-frequency, rhythmic, and entirely information-free auditory signals that the human's own language classified as giggles. The curators, a dozen of them, materialized at the edge of the plaza, their serene, white light pulsing with a controlled but deeply, deeply alarmed frequency. Their first and most logical assumption was that they were witnessing a form of ritualized intraspecies conflict. The pursuit, the chasing, the physical contact, it was all a clear and terrifying simulation of a predator-prey dynamic. They were about to intervene, to separate the combatants, to quarantine the area, and begin a full systemic diagnostic on the humans' malfunctioning aggression protocols. But then, they saw the faces. The expressions on the human children's faces were not of fear, or of anger, or of any quantifiable strategic emotion. They were expressions of a high-energy, positive emotional state that the Academy's archives could only, and with a great deal of logical uncertainty, classify as joy. The humans were not fighting. They were playing, and the concept in its pure and beautiful and terrifying uselessness was a paradox that the assembled, logical minds of the curators could not, for a long and very, very silent moment, resolve. The alien children in their perfect silent lines were equally baffled, but their bafflement was tinged with something new, something that was not a part of their standard emotional programming. It was a flicker of a nascent and deeply, deeply heretical feeling. It was curiosity. One of the young Cathar, a student named Xylos, whose own crystalline mind was a perfect and so far flawless replica of his father's, found his attention being drawn away from his silent internal data processing. He was watching the humans. He was watching their strange, inefficient, and beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic dance. He felt a strange and deeply illogical desire. He wanted to understand. He took a single tentative step out of his line. The curator nearest to him immediately sent a gentle and deeply, deeply insistent psychic pulse. Student Xylos, return to your designated optimization position. The human units are experiencing a predictable and contained cultural malfunction. It is not relevant to your curriculum. Xylos paused. Every line of his logical, ordered programming told him to obey. But the sight of Lily, as she skidded to a halt, reversed direction, and began to chase Leo, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated and deeply, deeply infectious glee, was a data point that his curriculum had not prepared him for. He took another step. It was in that moment that Lily, in a stroke of pure and accidental diplomatic genius, changed the game. She was not just running anymore. She was improvising. She was using the sterile, logical architecture of the plaza as an obstacle course. She leaped over a low, crystalline bench that was designed for silent contemplation. She dodged behind a holographic pillar that was displaying a beautiful and deeply, deeply boring, rotating image of a perfect, five-dimensional geometric shape. She was not just playing a game. She was having a conversation with her environment. And then she introduced a new and even more complex and terrifying concept. She looked at the silent, watching lines of the alien children, and she saw not an audience but potential players. She ran towards the Cathar line, her hand outstretched, her eyes shining with a universal and deeply, deeply dangerous invitation. Xyler, the High Curator, felt a surge of pure, systemic, and absolute panic. The malfunction was not contained. It was about to become a contagion. And he knew with a certainty that was a cold, hard and terrifyingly logical new proof, that if a single one of his perfect, logical, and deeply, deeply serious students ever learned the rules of this strange and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic human game, the Apex Academy and its entire, perfect, silent, and deeply, deeply boring philosophy would be in a single joyful and whooping cry of a word, utterly and irrevocably doomed. The contagion of fun was a slow and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply inevitable plague. It did not happen all at once. It happened in a series of small and deeply heretical acts of individual and courageous curiosity. Xylos the young Cathar did not join the game of tag. Not at first. But he did not return to his line. He stayed and he watched. And as he watched, his perfect, logical mind began to do something it had never been trained to do. It began to analyze the game. He saw that it was not just random, chaotic motion. It had rules, a complex and surprisingly elegant set of them. There was a designated it. There was a transfer of this state through physical contact. There was a clear and quantifiable objective to avoid the state of it. It was a system. A strange, inefficient, and deeply, deeply illogical system, but a system nonetheless. And it was a system that was constantly and beautifully evolving. Lily, in her boundless and now deeply, deeply studied creativity, introduced a new rule. The low crystalline benches, the ones that were designed for silent contemplation, were now base. A player touching a bench could not be tagged. This new rule added a layer of profound and deeply fascinating strategic complexity. It was no longer just a game of speed. It was now a game of spatial awareness, of risk assessment, of resource management. Xylos's crystalline form began to pulse with a low and deeply, deeply excited light. He was not just watching a game. He was watching a living, breathing, and rapidly evolving strategic simulation. The next day, during the nutritional and system optimization break, something unprecedented happened. Xylos did not join the humans, but he did not stand in his line. He walked to one of the crystalline benches and he stood beside it. He was not playing. He was simply, and with a profound and deeply, deeply revolutionary sense of his own new and individual choice, observing. He was a spectator, and in a society that had no concept of entertainment, The act of being a spectator was in itself a form of rebellion. His rebellion was a quiet and powerful one. A few other students, a young and deeply curious, Axiom, who was fascinated by the strange new geometry of the game, and a fungal botanist who was intrigued by the sheer biological inefficiency of it all, joined him. They formed a small, silent, and deeply, deeply heretical audience. The plaza was no longer just a space for silent individual optimization. It was now a stadium. The true breakthrough, the moment the old silent world of the academy truly began to crack, came not from a game of tag, but from a game of hide-and-seek. Lily, in her infinite and now deeply, deeply analyzed wisdom, had decided that tag was becoming too predictable. She gathered her small human tribe, and she explained the new rules. One person would be the seeker. The others would hide. The seeker would close their eyes and count to 100, giving the hiders time to find a place of concealment. It was a game of deception, of camouflage, of a deep and deeply, deeply tactical understanding of one's environment. It was this game that finally broke the dam. The concept of hiding, of deliberately obscuring one's presence, was a familiar one to the alien species. It was a survival tactic, a predator-prey dynamic. But the concept of doing it for fun, of a voluntary and temporary deception, was a logical paradox that their minds found both terrifying and deeply, deeply, irresistibly compelling. Xylos, who had spent the last week creating a complete and flawless mathematical model of the game of tag, could not resist. As Lena, the designated seeker, closed her eyes and began to count, Xylos did not just watch. He acted. He took a single, decisive, and history-altering step, and he hid. He flattened his crystalline form against the side of a holographic pillar, his own natural, light-refracting abilities, a perfect and deeply, deeply satisfying form of camouflage. He was no longer an observer. He was a player. He was hiding not from a predator, but from a small human girl who was at that very moment reaching the number 97 in her count. The great, silent, and beautiful, and terrible, and wonderful, and chaotic, and deeply, deeply human game had truly, and for the first and most important, and most wonderful, and most terrible, and most beautiful time, begun. The game of hide-and-seek was a quiet apocalypse. When Lena, her count of 100 complete, turned and shouted the ritualistic human phrase, "Ready or not, here I come," a new law of physics seemed to ripple through the silent, sacred plaza of the Apex Academy. She was the seeker, a known variable. But the hiders were an unknown, a scattered and chaotic collection of possibilities. And for the first time, one of those possibilities was not human. Lena, with the innate and deeply illogical talent of a human child, was a terrifyingly effective seeker. She did not think in straight lines or probabilities. She thought like a predator, but a predator of mischief. She looked not for the most logical hiding place, but for the most interesting one. She found her brother Leo almost immediately, his attempt to hide behind his own smaller holographic pillar, a failure of both imagination and physics. But she did not tag him. She simply put a finger to her lips, a gesture of conspiracy so alien and so complex that the observing curator's translation matrices could only classify it as collusive, nonverbal data sharing, and she moved on. She was not just playing the game. She was managing the dramatic tension. Her search for Xylos, the young Cathar, was a masterpiece of unintentional, interspecies psychological warfare. She knew he was hiding near one of the pillars, but she pretended not to. She would walk past his hiding spot, her head turned the other way, and Xylos, his crystalline form a perfect shimmering camouflage against the holographic light, would feel a surge of a new and deeply, deeply thrilling emotion. It was a complex data stream of relief, of triumph, of the pure, unadulterated joy of a successful deception. It was the most illogical and most wonderful feeling he had ever experienced. When Lena finally found him, leaping out from behind a different pillar with a joyful shout of, "Found you," where Xylos did not react with the calm, analytical detachment of his species. His crystalline form flashed a brilliant, surprised, and deeply, deeply pleased shade of azure. He had been a participant. He had played a role. He had, by the strange new rules of this human game, succeeded. He had been a good hider. The concept of a good hider was a new and deeply satisfying addition to his personal lexicon. The curators, observing from the edge of the plaza, were in a state of quiet, systemic chaos. Their initial diagnosis of a cultural malfunction was proving to be catastrophically inadequate. The malfunction was not just spreading, it was being welcomed. They watched as Xylos, the star pupil of his generation, the flawless logical mind who was destined to one day join their own serene ranks, was now smiling. A Cathar did not have a face, not in the human sense, but the joyful, rhythmic pulsing of his internal light was a broadcast of pure, unambiguous, and deeply, deeply heretical amusement. High Curator Xylar felt the foundation of his million-year-old educational philosophy begin to crumble. He had built a perfect, silent temple to the god of knowledge, and a small human girl had just, with a shout and a giggle, successfully turned it into a playground. The plague of play did not spread like a wildfire. It spread like a seed, a quiet and persistent and deeply, deeply interesting new idea that took root in the fertile and previously untilled soil of the students' minds. The next day, during the nutritional and system optimization break, Xylos was not the only one to step out of line. The young Axiom, a being of pure geometric energy named Unit 9, who had been fascinated by the strange, new and beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic geometry of the game, floated silently over to the human children. It did not speak. It did not play. It simply hovered, its perfect spherical form a silent and deeply, deeply curious question mark. It was Leo, the quieter of the human twins, who became the next great missionary of fun. He looked at the hovering silent sphere and he saw not an alien but a ball. In an act of pure and beautiful and deeply, deeply instinctive human childhood, he reached out and he gently, playfully pushed it. The reaction was, for the Academy, the second great cataclysm. Unit 9, a being of pure and perfectly controlled energy, was suddenly, and without its consent, in motion. It drifted in a slow and deeply, deeply surprised arc across the plaza. And then Lena, with the perfect and beautiful and terrible, wonderful, chaotic timing of her twin, pushed it back. The Axiom, one of the most powerful and most logical forms of life in the universe, had just become a participant in a game of catch. The plaza, which had for millennia been a place of silent, static, and individual contemplation, was now a place of motion, of interaction, of a strange, new, and beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic, and deeply, deeply collaborative energy. The silent, orderly lines of the alien students began to fray at the edges. They were not all joining the games. Not yet, but they were all watching. A social schism, a great and silent and deeply, deeply profound intellectual divide, was forming in the heart of the student body. On one side were the traditionalists, the ones who remained in their lines, their minds focused on the pure and increasingly, deeply, deeply boring act of data absorption. And on the other side were the players, a new and growing and deeply, deeply heretical faction who had been touched by the beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic, and deeply, deeply infectious human concept of a good time, High Curator Xylar, in a move that was seen by his fellow curators as a radical and deeply, deeply dangerous act of appeasement, did not shut down the games. He did the opposite. He sanctioned them. He designated a specific and carefully monitored section of the Central Plaza as a human cultural practice zone. He then tasked a team of the Academy's most brilliant and most horrified sociologists and physicists with a new and deeply, deeply strange research project to create a complete and quantifiable and logically consistent scientific model of the human phenomenon known as play. They were, in essence, being asked to write an equation for laughter. It was the most difficult and most important and most beautiful and most terrible and most wonderful and most chaotic and most deeply, deeply human assignment the Apex Academy had ever given. The official scientific analysis of play was a masterpiece of logical and deeply, deeply confused observation. The curators' reports, which were presented to a silent and deeply, deeply anxious High Council, were a collection of baffling and often contradictory data points. They reported that the students who engaged in the random, non-productive energy expenditure of the human games showed a statistically significant increase in their neural plasticity. Their minds, which had been like perfect and rigid crystal lattices, were becoming more fluid, more adaptable. They were not just absorbing data anymore. They were beginning to connect it in new and strange and deeply, deeply creative ways. The traditionalist students, the ones who had remained in their silent, perfect lines, were still the masters of pure and perfect data retention. They could recite the entire billion-year history of the axiom concordance without a single misplaced data point. But the players, the ones who had spent their breaks chasing each other, or hiding, or gently, and with a great deal of laughter, pushing a floating ball of pure energy back and forth, were beginning to do something new and strange and deeply, deeply powerful. They were beginning to ask questions. A young Cathar, after a particularly exhilarating game of hide-and-seek, had during his next lesson on stellar mechanics asked a question that had never, in the million-year history of the Academy, been asked before. He had not asked for more data. He had asked, "Mom, but what if the star wanted to hide?" The question was, from a purely logical standpoint, insane, but it was also, from a purely creative standpoint, brilliant. It was a question that had, in a single, beautiful, and deeply, deeply playful leap of imagination, just invented the entire, and previously unknown, field of sentient, cosmological psychology. The learning process of the players was becoming deeper, more contextual, and more creative. They were not just memorizing the score of the Universal Symphony anymore. They were beginning to hear the music, and the traditionalists, the perfect and now deeply, deeply anxious little calculators, were beginning to fall behind. They had the library, but the players were beginning to write the books. The human children, in their glorious and now deeply, deeply studied ignorance, had become the most effective and most disruptive teachers the Academy had ever known. They had, without a single formal lesson plan, introduced the most advanced and most powerful and most beautiful and most terrible and most wonderful and most chaotic and most deeply, deeply human concepts of them all, the concepts of cooperation, of competition, of the team. And the final and most glorious and most terrible and most beautiful and most wonderful and most chaotic and most deeply, deeply human lesson was about to begin. It was a game that was not just a game. It was a war. It was a culture. It was a philosophy. It was a beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human thing called Capture the Flag. Capture the Flag was not a game. It was a revelation. It was the perfect and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human synthesis of all the strange, new concepts the alien children had been so cautiously and so eagerly learning. It had rules, a clear objective and a quantifiable win state, which appealed to their logical, orderly minds. But it also had something new, something that was a beautiful and terrifying and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human thing. It had teams. The first game was a simple one. The 3 human children against any of the aliens who were brave or foolish enough to join. Xylos, the Cathar, was the first to volunteer. Unit 9, the Axiom, who had discovered a profound and deeply, deeply satisfying joy in the simple and beautiful and terrible, wonderful, chaotic physics of being a ball, was the second. A handful of others, their curiosity now a force more powerful than a millennium of silent, logical programming, followed. The teams were formed. The flags, 2 brightly colored pieces of cloth that Lily had produced from a pocket in her strange and deeply, deeply inefficient human clothing, were placed. The game began. What followed was a masterpiece of emergent and deeply, deeply beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human strategy. It was a war, but a war with no casualties. A conflict where the only prize was the pure and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human thing called bragging rights. The abilities of the different species, which had once been a simple matter of biological classification, were now tactical assets. The fungal botanist, a creature that could change its skin color to perfectly match its surroundings, became the ultimate spy, a living, breathing, and deeply, deeply effective camouflage unit. Unit 9, the Axiom, discovered that it could use its own internal energy field to create a small and surprisingly effective defensive shield around its flag. And Xylos, the Cathar, who had spent his entire young life learning to think in straight, logical lines, had become a master of the feint, the bluff, the beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human art of the strategic misdirection. He was not just a player. He was a general, a leader, a captain. He was applying the flawless cold logic of his Cathar mind to the beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human art of a game that was, in its heart, a story. The Curators watched, their silent, serene, and now deeply, deeply conflicted, minds a battleground of their own. They were watching the birth of a new and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply hybrid culture. They were watching their perfect, logical, and deeply, deeply serious students learning to be leaders, to be strategists, to be teammates, to be friends. And they were learning it all not from a data stream but from a game, a silly, pointless, and beautiful and terrible and wonderful, and chaotic and deeply, deeply human game. High Curator Xylar stood at the edge of the plaza, his own ancient and flawless crystalline mind a silent and deeply, deeply profound war. The old way of the academy, the silent and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply boring way, was dying. The data was irrefutable. The students who played were not just happier, they were better. They were smarter, more creative, more adaptable. The cultural malfunction was not a bug. It was a feature, an upgrade, a new and beautiful and terrible and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human operating system for the soul. And he, the High Curator, the guardian of a millennium of silent, perfect, and deeply, deeply serious tradition, had to make a choice. He had to decide whether to restore the silence, or to do the one simple and revolutionary, and beautiful and terrible, and wonderful and chaotic and deeply, deeply human thing he had never, in 1,000 years of perfect silent knowing, ever done before. He had to choose a side, and he had to learn how to play. High Curator Xylar's decision to participate was not a choice. It was a surrender to a new and far more compelling form of logic. He glided from the shadowed colonnade at the edge of the plaza, his ancient crystalline form a silent, shimmering question mark, and approached the chaotic heart of the game. He stopped before Lily, the small human architect of his world's beautiful undoing, and projected a single, universe-altering thought. Teach me. The game of Capture the Flag, and with it the fragile, nascent culture of play at the Apex Academy, came to a sudden, reverent halt. The sight of the High Curator, the living embodiment of 1,000,000 years of silent, stoic tradition, asking a child to teach him a game was a moment of such profound historical significance that it silenced even the giggles. Lily, however, seemed to miss the monumental nature of the event entirely. She simply saw a new, very tall and very shiny potential player. "Okay," she said, her voice a clear bell in the sudden vast silence. "But you have to be on my team because their team is cheating." She pointed an accusatory finger at her brother, who responded with a look of pure theatrical innocence. The great schism between the players and the traditionalists had just been superseded by a new and far more important conflict: shirts versus skins. Xylar's first lesson in the art of play was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. As a being of pure, instantaneous calculation, the concept of catching a thrown object was a simple matter of computing its trajectory, velocity, and spin, then positioning his manipulator limbs at the precise coordinates of its arrival. He never missed. But as his new, frustrated human teachers explained, he never actually caught it. He was performing a sterile act of interception, not participating in the joyful, unpredictable dance of the game. "You have to feel it, Xylar," Lily would shout, her voice filled with a child's perfect, unhelpful clarity. "Stop thinking about it. Just catch it." It was the single most illogical piece of advice the High Curator had ever received. He was being asked to stop using the one perfect tool that had defined his entire existence. He was being asked to turn off his brain and trust something his culture did not even have a word for. He was being asked to trust his gut, a piece of anatomy he did not possess. His attempts were clumsy, and for the first time in his life, he experienced the deeply educational, and surprisingly not unpleasant, sensation of failure. The High Curator's public, and often clumsy, attempts to learn how to play sent a shockwave through the academy. The traditionalist faction, a silent and now horrified majority of the curators and their students, saw it as the final, unforgivable act of cultural suicide. Their de facto leader, a stern and brilliant curator named Prax, whose crystalline form was a cold, unforgiving shade of pure white, saw it as a declaration of internal war. The academy, Prax argued in a series of frantic and flawlessly logical telepathic broadcasts to the High Council, was on the verge of a total systemic collapse. The data was clear and irrefutable. While the neural plasticity of the player faction had increased by a remarkable margin, their core data retention scores had begun to show minor, but statistically significant deviations. They were no longer just absorbing the pure, clean data of the core. They were actively interpreting it. They were adding their own messy, illogical context, remembering not just the date of a historical event, but how that event felt. They were not just learning the equations of physics. They were beginning to argue about whether the equations were pretty. The purity of objective knowledge was being contaminated by the chaos of subjective opinion. Sylar, in his newfound wisdom, did not argue or present a counterproof. He simply, with a frustrating sense of playful authority that was itself a new and terrifying variable for Prax to process, invited his old colleague to the plaza. "Show me a better way," he challenged. His thought an invitation to a debate that would be fought not with words but with a final, binding game. The result was the Apex game, a single, winner-take-all contest that would decide the future of the Academy's entire educational philosophy. The rules, drafted by a joint committee of traditionalists and players, were a complex and beautiful synthesis of 1,000 strategic simulations and a dozen human children's games. It was a war game, a resource management puzzle, a test of pure logic and a profound test of a team's ability to tell a compelling story. The stakes were absolute. The winning team's philosophy would become the sole guiding principle of the Academy. If Prax and the traditionalists won, play would be banned forever. The human children would be sent home and the sacred silence would be restored. If the players won, the new chaotic way of learning would become the new law. The two great silent armies of the mind gathered in the plaza, the fate of 1,000,000 years of tradition hanging on the outcome of a single, glorious, and deeply silly game. The Apex game commenced within a state of deceptive order. The playing field was a holographic simulation of a newly discovered star system, its single habitable planet, plagued by extreme and unpredictable environmental hostility. The objective was simple: be the first team to successfully and sustainably terraform it, achieving a stable, self-sufficient biosphere. Prax and the traditionalists approached the problem with a terrifying and beautiful efficiency. Their strategy was a flawless, mathematically optimized algorithm that they had developed over weeks of silent, perfect calculation. They knew the precise amount of atmospheric processing required, the optimal distribution of bioengineered flora, and the most efficient method of resource extraction from the system's asteroid belt. Their every move was a perfect logical step in a flawlessly calculated plan. They did not make mistakes. They did not take risks. They were building a perfect, sterile, and predictable new world. The players' team, captained by a newly confident Xylos, was a chaotic and beautiful disaster. Advised by the 3 human children who served as a sort of wild-card consulting committee, their strategy was a series of brilliant and often contradictory improvisations. They didn't start with atmospheric processing. They started by attempting to communicate with the planet's single, native and highly aggressive species of silicon-based megafauna, an effort that involved a great deal of interpretive dance and resulted in the immediate and enthusiastic consumption of their first batch of terraforming drones. They didn't harvest the asteroid belt for minerals. They tried to arrange the asteroids into a giant, pointless smiley face, a project that consumed vast amounts of energy for no discernible strategic gain. They weren't terraforming a planet. They were getting to know it. For the first half of the game, the traditionalists were winning by an insurmountable margin. Their terraforming index, a live score displayed for all to see, was rising with the smooth, predictable curve of a perfect equation. The players' index was a chaotic mess of spikes and dips, a testament to their failed experiments and wasted resources. In a moment of pure inspiration born of desperation, they attempted to solve the planet's high-velocity wind problem by building a series of giant, inefficient, and surprisingly musical windmills. The project was a catastrophic failure as a power source, but the planet was, for the first time, filled with a strange and hauntingly beautiful sound. The turning point of the game was not a brilliant move. It was a cosmic joke. The traditionalists in their flawless plan had encountered an unforeseen variable. The planet's axial tilt, which they had calculated as stable, was in fact deeply and erratically unstable, leading to catastrophic and illogical seasonal shifts that their models had not predicted. Their perfect, delicate ecosystem, which had been designed for a perfect, stable climate, collapsed in a single, brutal, and system-wide extinction event. Their terraforming index plummeted. Their perfect plan had a fatal and deeply, deeply ironic flaw. Prax and his team reacted to the environmental instability with a furious and brilliant display of pure logic. They immediately designed a series of massive geosynchronous orbital mirrors to correct the planet's wobble and stabilize its rotation. It was a perfect, elegant solution that their own projections showed would take approximately 1 century to construct and implement. They were trying to solve a hurricane by building a better and much, much slower wall. The players, on the other hand, reacted with an act of pure human-inspired genius. They did not try to fix the planet. They embraced its flaw, led by a sudden and deeply silly idea from Lily, who declared that wonky seasons are the best seasons. They abandoned their own, failing terraforming efforts and built something new. They created a society, a culture that was designed to thrive within the planet's chaotic and beautiful instability. They designed homes that could burrow deep underground during the months-long fire season, and created migratory, fast-growing crops that were inefficient but wonderfully delicious and could be harvested in the brief, temperate weeks between the flash freezes and the hurricane-force winds. They did not build a perfect world. They built an interesting and resilient one. In the end, by the cold and meaningless logic of the original rules, the traditionalists won. Their terraforming index at the game's conclusion was a fraction of a percentage point higher, a testament to the single, functioning atmospheric processor they had managed to get online before their ecosystem collapsed. But as the simulation ended, and the 2 new worlds were displayed side by side in the great, silent plaza for all to see, the true and final and irrefutable victory was clear. One world was a perfect, sterile, and ultimately failed laboratory, a monument to a flawless plan that had shattered on contact with a single, inconvenient truth. The other was a chaotic, inefficient, and breathtakingly alive home, a testament to the messy, beautiful, and profoundly, wonderfully human art of adaptation. Prax, his perfect, logical mind shattered by this profound and deeply, deeply human truth, did the only logical thing he could do. He turned to Xylar, his old friend who was now the living embodiment of this strange, new, and beautiful, terrible, wonderful, chaotic wisdom. He asked the simple, revolutionary question that would define the future of the Apex Academy and the galaxy forever. Okay. Pry.